Acorcia's diary, pale and troubled, as if he had seen something that shook him to his core, he refused to discuss what he had seen, would not even tell his colleagues a year later. He was dead. The official cause was listed as sudden fever convenient. In 1568, there was another incident. Elizabeth collapsed during a council meeting. When her ladies got her to her chambers and loosened her clothing, one of them fainted, the others cleared. The room immediately, no explanation was ever given. What did they see? Some modern medical historians have suggested Elizabeth may have had androgen insensitivity syndrome, a condition where someone has XY chromosomes but appears extremely female because their body does not respond to testosterone. People with eyes are often taller than average, have a deeper voice, low body hair, and lack functional female reproductive organs. They appear completely female externally but cannot menstruate or get pregnant. It would explain everything: the inability to marry, the lack of period. Several sources hint that Elizabeth did not have monthly cycles like other women, though they are always vague about it. The masculine qualities observers noted the secret that doctors saw and refused to discuss. Other historians have suggested different conditions: testicular feminization syndrome, Swyer syndrome, various intersex conditions that would have made pregnancy impossible while allowing her to appear female. But we will never know for certain, because the one piece of evidence that could tell us her skeleton remains sealed in Westminster Abbey. The British establishment has refused every single request from historians and scientists to examine her remains for 4 centuries. They have said no. In 1952, during the coronation of Elizabeth II, there was a movement among historians to finally examine the remains of Elizabeth I. Denied in 1975 when new non-invasive scanning technology became available. They asked again, denied in 2003. On the 400th anniversary of her death, a formal petition from multiple universities was denied. Why were they protecting? The official reason is always respect for the dead, but they have allowed examination of other royal remains. Richard III was exhumed in 2012 and studied extensively. His skeleton was CT scanned, DNA tested, analyzed in every possible way. Other Tudor-era burials have been investigated. The tomb of Henry VI has been opened. The remains of Catherine of Aragon have been examined. Even medieval monarchs have been studied. Why not Elizabeth? What is different about her? The answer seems obvious: because whatever is in that coffin does not match the legend, and the legend is too valuable to risk. But let us move forward, because whether or not Elizabeth could have children, she spent 45 years telling England she chose not to, and that choice, real or forced, came with a price. The white makeup was called Venetian ceruse. It was all the rage in courts across Europe. The recipe: white lead mixed with vinegar. Sometimes they added arsenic to make it stick. Better you read that right, lead and arsenic applied to the face every single day. The process was elaborate. First, you would wash your face with a mixture that was supposed to prepare the skin, usually something acidic that actually damaged it. Then you would apply the ceruse in thick layers, building it up until your skin was perfectly white and smooth. The effect was striking in candlelight. With the white makeup and red lips and elaborate clothing, Elizabeth must have looked otherworldly, like a living statue, a goddess made flesh. But lead is a neurotoxin. It does not just sit on your skin, it absorbs through it into your bloodstream, into your bones, into your brain. The symptoms of chronic lead poisoning read like a catalog of Elizabeth's documented health problems: headaches. She suffered from severe recurring headaches her entire adult life, so bad that sometimes she would have to cancel public appearances. Abdominal pain constantly. Her ladies reported that she often could not eat because of stomach cramps, joint pain, and muscle weakness. By her 40s, Elizabeth had trouble with stairs. By her 50s, she needed assistance standing after sitting for long periods, mood swings, and irritability. Elizabeth was famous for her temper. She would be charming one moment, screaming the next. She once threw a slipper at one of her ministers. Another time, she slapped a lady in waiting across the face for a minor mistake. Memory problems and confusion. In her later years, courtiers noted that Elizabeth would sometimes lose track of conversations or forget things that had just been discussed. Insomnia. She barely slept, would pace her chambers at night. Her ladies took shifts, staying awake. With her anemia, historical accounts describe her as often pale and weak, needing to sit during events where she would normally stand. All of these are consistent with chronic lead poisoning. For 45 years, Elizabeth was slowly poisoning herself, and she could not stop, because every time she appeared in public, she had to look ageless, eternal, divine. The mask was not vanity. It was political survival. Any sign of weakness, any crack in the facade, and the wolves would circle Spain, was always waiting for an excuse to invade. Catholic assassins were always plotting. Her own nobles were always calculating whether they could do better with a Different monarch Elizabeth's power rested entirely on her image of invincibility. So every morning her ladies applied the poison layer after layer until her face was a white shield, until lead had soaked so deep into her skin that even when she washed it off at night, white residue remained in every pore, and beneath the makeup the damage accumulated year after year. By her 40s her skin was dry, and flaking the lead was breaking down her skin's natural moisture barrier. Her ladies had to apply increasingly thick layers to cover the damage. By her 50s, she had open sores, small ones at first, then larger. The lead was literally corroding her skin. They would cover the sores with extra makeup, which made them worse, which required more makeup, a vicious cycle. By her 60s, according to one lady in waiting who gave secret testimony years later, Elizabeth had patches of blackened flesh on her face and neck that wept yellow fluid and would not heal necrosis tissue death from decades of lead exposure. But in public she was perfect, glowing, untouchable. The fairy Queen Gloriana, the portraits from her later reign, are telling. They become increasingly stylized, increasingly unrealistic. The rainbow portrait from around 1600 shows Elizabeth as a young woman. Though she was nearly 70, no wrinkles, perfect skin. It is not a portrait of a person, it is an icon, a symbol, because the real Elizabeth, the woman beneath, the paint was falling apart. The corset was the other torture device. Elizabeth, in court fashion, demanded a specific silhouette, tiny waist, flat chest, rigid triangular torso. To achieve this, women wore corsets reinforced with whalebone wood or steel lace so tight they could barely breathe. Elizabeth wore hers tighter than anyone had to at state functions. She needed to stand for hours without showing fatigue. The corset held her upright when her body wanted to collapse. It was a cage of prison structural support for a building that was crumbling from the inside. A properly laced Elizabeth's corset reduced the waist by 4 to 6 inches. Elizabeth's ladies reported lacing hers even tighter, 6 to 8 inches of compression every day for 45 years. What does that do to a body? Your ribs bend inward over time. They deform permanently. Your lungs cannot fully inflate. Your breathing is shallow all the time, never getting quite enough air. Your liver gets compressed and displaced. Your intestines are squashed. Digestion becomes agonizing because there is nowhere for your stomach to expand. Standing or sitting, you are inconstant. Discomfort lying down is the only relief, but even that is limited because your rib cage has been reshaped. Autopsy reports from other noble women of the era show the damage: cracked ribs, indented livers, compressed lungs with reduced capacity, spinal deformities from the constant, unnatural posture. Elizabeth's ladies reported that when they finally cut the corset off, her corpse or torso was covered in deep grooves, permanent indentations in her flesh where the bones had pressed for 45 years. The grooves were so deep you could see the outline of the corset structure imprinted in her skin like a fossil. Imagine your clothing leaving permanent marks in your body. Imagine that level of constant pressure for 4 decades. But Elizabeth could not stop wearing it because without it she would look weak, soft, human. And she needed to look superhuman. Every public appearance was an endurance test, standing in the corset for hours, breathing shallow in pain, smiling. And if she showed any discomfort, any weakness, it would be in every ambassador's report. By nightfall, Spain would hear about it, France would hear about it, Rome would hear about it, and they would all start calculating how much longer England's queen would last. So she stood and smiled and slowly destroyed her body to preserve her power. The 1570s and 80s brought new pressures that made everything worse. Mary, Queen of Scots, arrived in England in 1568, fleeing a rebellion in Scotland. She was Elizabeth's cousin. She was Catholic. She was beautiful. She was fertile. She had a son, which Elizabeth did not. And according to Catholic Europe, she was a legitimate Queen of England because Elizabeth was a bastard born in a legal marriage. Mary was a walking threat just by existing. She gave every Catholic in England someone to rally around. Every plot against Elizabeth had Mary at its center. The Ridolfi plot in 1571 to assassinate Elizabeth, marry Mary to the Duke of Norfolk, and place her on the throne was discovered and stopped. The Throckmorton plot in 1583, a Spanish invasion coordinated with an uprising to murder Elizabeth and crown Mary, was discovered and stopped. The Babington plot in 1586 was the one that finally sealed Mary's fate. A group of young Catholic nobles planned to kill Elizabeth and free Mary. The plot was infiltrated by Elizabeth's spymaster Francis Walsingham. He let it develop, gathering evidence until he had proof that Mary knew about and approved the assassination. Elizabeth hesitated for months. Mary was a queen anointed by God. Executing her would set a terrifying precedent that monarchs could be held accountable, could be killed legally. It would undermine the entire divine right of kings. But finally, in February 1587 Elizabeth signed the death warrant. Mary was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle. Elizabeth claimed afterward that the warrant was sent without her final approval, that her secretary had acted without authorization. It was probably a way to avoid responsibility, while still getting the results she needed. But here's what is interesting. After Mary's execution, Elizabeth fell into a deep depression that lasted months. Some historians think was political theater, showing Europe that she had no choice but. Her ladies reported that it was real. Elizabeth barely ate, barely slept, sat for hours staring at nothing. Was it guilt? Maybe Mary was her cousin. They had never met in person, but they had corresponded for years. Elizabeth had kept Mary in prison for 19 years before finally killing her. Or was it something else? Was it the recognition that she had just killed the one woman in England who represented everything? Elizabeth was not Mary, had been married 3 times, had a son, had been desired and loved, and betrayed and lost everything, and still had something. Elizabeth. Never would Mary had a biological legacy. Elizabeth ruled England, but Mary's son James would inherit it. That must have been bitter. But killing Mary did not end the threat, it intensified it, because now Philip II of Spain had the perfect excuse for war. The Spanish Armada, 1588, the largest invasion force England had ever faced, 130 ships, 30,000 men. The plan: sail up the English Channel, link up with the Spanish army in the Netherlands, invade England, depose Elizabeth, restore Catholicism. If it had succeeded, Elizabeth would have been executed. England would have become a Spanish puppet state. The Protestant Reformation in England would have been erased. Elizabeth was 54 years old, in constant pain from a lead poisoned corset and what was probably undiagnosed arthritis, suffering from the depression after Mary's execution, barely sleeping because of nightmares and political pressure. And she rode out to Tilbury to address her troops. This is one of the most famous moments in English history. Elizabeth in armor, a ceremonial breastplate over her dress, on a white horse, surrounded by soldiers. A speech: I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. And think foul scorn that Palmer or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm. It is magnificent. It is inspiring. It has been quoted for 400 years as an example of courage and leadership. What they do not tell you is what happened before and after. Before, Elizabeth was so weak from a recent illness, probably another flare-up of whatever chronic condition she was hiding, that she could barely mount her horse. Her ladies had to practically lift her into the saddle. They gave her wine mixed with something, possibly a stimulant, to keep her alert and upright during the review for 3 hours. She was every inch the warrior queen, riding along the lines, making eye contact with soldiers, projecting strength and confidence and absolute certainty of victory. It was a performance, the greatest performance of her life. At work, the soldiers went from nervous to fanatical. They would have followed her into hell after she collapsed completely. She could not leave her chambers for a week. The pain was so severe she could not eat solid food. Her doctors whispered about internal bleeding, but could not examine her to confirm. One of her ladies wrote in a private letter the triumph at Tilbury has cost her dearly. She suffers greatly, though none are permitted to speak of it. The Armada was destroyed partly by English tactics, partly by Atlantic storms that scattered and sank the Spanish fleet. England celebrated. Elizabeth became Gloriana, the immortal queen, the Protestant champion, and in her private rooms she bled and suffered and put the mask back on. The 1590s were when everything started to unravel. Robert Dudley died in 1588, just weeks after the Armada fever and stomach illness, probably cancer. He was 55. Elizabeth had loved him for 30 years. She locked herself in her rooms and would not come out, would not eat, would not see anyone. Her counselors had to threaten to break down the door before she finally emerged. She wore his last letter in a pouch around her neck for the rest of her life, kept every gift he had ever given her, forbid anyone from speaking ill of him in her presence. The grief was real. The only man she had ever loved gone, and she was utterly alone. She tried to fill the void with new favorites. Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, Dudley's stepson, 20 years younger than Elizabeth, handsome, charismatic, reckless. She adored him, gave him commands, forgave his mistakes, defended him against critics. It was almost motherly the way she doted on him, and Essex took advantage. He was arrogant, convinced he was indispensable. When she sent him to Ireland to put down a rebellion, he failed miserably, made an unauthorized truce with the rebels, and rushed back to England without permission. He burst into Elizabeth's private chambers early one morning unannounced. Elizabeth was still in her nightgown. Her wig was off, her makeup was off. The first time in decades someone saw Elizabeth's real face. Essex froze. The accounts differ on exactly what he saw, but all agree he was shocked. He stammered an apology and backed out. Elizabeth never forgave him for that and not for the political failures. For seeing her without the mask in 1601, Essex tried to stage a coup, tried to march on the palace with armed supporters. It was pathetic the coup fell apart immediately, but it was treason Elizabeth signed as execution warrant, according to her ladies. She wept while signing it, but she signed it. Essex was beheaded on February 25th, 1601. He was 34 years old. After his execution, Elizabeth was never the same. The depression that had always stalked her finally caught up. She stopped caring about appearances, stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping. Her counselors begged her to name an heir. She refused, maybe out of superstition. Naming an heir felt like inviting death, maybe out of political calculation. The second she named an heir, that person would become the focus of every plot and scheme, and she would become irrelevant, or maybe she just did not care anymore. The physical decay accelerated in her final years. By 1600, she had lost most of her teeth to lead, and the sugar she consumed compulsively had rotted them away. Her breath smelled terrible. She stuffed her cheeks with cloth to maintain the shape of her face in public, which made speaking difficult and eating almost impossible. Her hair was gone, wiped out by the lead, distress, and age. She wore increasingly elaborate wigs, some piled 2 feet high, decorated with jewels and pearls and gold wire. They were so heavy they gave her headaches, but she needed them, needed the illusion of youth. Her hands shook constantly, tremors that made writing difficult, made holding things uncertain. Could be more lead poisoning, could be early Parkinson's, could just be accumulated damage from 70 years of stress and survival. Her eyesight was failing. She could barely read anymore. Without glasses, which she refused to wear in public, because it made her look old. And then there was a smell. Multiple sources from her final years mention it, always carefully, always euphemistically. The apartments of Her Majesty must be well aired daily. But one lady in waiting, in a private letter written years after Elizabeth's death, is more explicit. There was a corruption in the body of Her Majesty that no perfume could disguise the smell of. Sickness and decay that pervaded her rooms. We burned incense constantly, but it only masked the worst of what was causing a tumor and abscess from the corset's constant pressure, an internal infection that her immune system could not fight off because of the lead poison. We do not know, but something inside Elizabeth Tudor was rotting while she still lived, and she knew it had to know it, but she could not acknowledge it, could not seek proper medical care, because that would mean admitting weakness. So she suffered in silence, the smell of her own decay following her through the palace. By late 1602, the courtiers could see the end coming. Elizabeth was visibly failing, thinner, weaker, more confused. A famous temper was giving way to strange, quiet moods where she would sit for hours, saying nothing. Foreign ambassadors wrote to their kings, prepare for transition. England's queen is dying, but Elizabeth kept performing, kept appearing in public with her white face and red wig and elaborate gowns, kept insisting everything was fine until she could not anymore. January 1603, Elizabeth is 69. She has been queen for 44 years. She is exhausted. She stops wearing the makeup, just stops. Her ladies are horrified. Without it, everyone will see the scars, the discoloration, the damage. She does not care anymore. I am past care what they see, she reportedly told one lady. She stops eating not from choice, but because swallowing has become agony. Her throat is swollen. Her stomach cannot tolerate food. She manages sips of broth, some wine. Nothing more. Her abdomen swells grotesquely. She looks 6 months pregnant, a cruel joke for the Virgin Queen. It is probably fluid accumulation from organ failure, her liver and kidneys shutting down, unable to process waste fluid backing up into her body cavity. But the symbolism is devastating. After a lifetime of virginity, refusing marriage and children, her body mocks her with the appearance of pregnancy. She refuses to go to bed. This becomes the defining feature of her final weeks. Her doctors beg her, her counselors plead with her, her ladies try to persuade her. She will not do it. She sits in chairs, leans against piles of cushions on the floor. Her ladies hold her upright. Days pass, then a week, 2 weeks. She barely speaks. When she does, is fragments, names of people long dead, half-remembered prayers in Latin. Sometimes she laughs for no apparent reason. Sometimes she stares at corners of the room and asks who is there when nobody is. Why will she not lie down? Her ladies asked. She gave different answers. Once I lie in that bed, I shall never rise again. Another time the bed is a trap. Death waits there another time. She said nothing, just shook her head violently. Some historians think it was psychological, that lying down meant surrender, meant accepting death. And Elizabeth had spent 70 years refusing to surrender to anything. Others suggest it was medical, perhaps lying flat put unbearable pressure on her damaged organs. Perhaps the fluid in her abdomen made breathing impossible. When horizontal, perhaps the pain was simply too severe, or perhaps she was just delirious. The lead poisoned the organ, failure, the starvation, her brain was shutting down. Maybe there was no rational reason. Maybe she was just confused and terrified and holding on to the last shred of control. She had staying upright. Her counselors, meanwhile, were panicking. She had not named an heir if she died, without designating a successor England could descend into. Civil War, Catholics and Protestants fighting over the throne, foreign powers invading during the chaos. They brought her name after name, James VI of Scotland, Mary's son, Protestant, the logical choice. She would not respond. Arabella Stuart, another cousin, also Protestant, nothing, various English noble, silence. Finally, on March 23rd, they got her to make some gesture toward James. Accounts differ on whether she actually spoke his name or just nodded when it was suggested, but it was enough. The succession was secured that night. She finally consented bed, or rather she collapsed and could not be moved. They carried her to the royal bed, laid her gently on pillows. Her breathing was labored, irregular. Her eyes were open but unfocused. She could not speak any more. The archbishop knelt beside her and prayed. Her ladies held her hands. Her counselors stood in the corners, already planning the transition to James. She lasted through the night as dawn approached on March 24th, 1603. Her breathing became more and more shallow, then stopped. Elizabeth Tudor died. No profound last words, no deathbed confession. She just stopped breathing. And then the cover-up began. The doors were locked immediately. Guards posted. Only the most trusted ladies were allowed to remain. The counselors gave explicit orders. Speak of nothing, you see nothing. When they began to undress her body layer by layer, the horror emerged. The makeup came off in sheets, taking skin with it. What lay beneath was not the face of an old woman. It was something worse, black, ulcerated, necrotic tissue from decades of lead eating through her flesh. One lady vomited and had to be removed. The corset left grooves in her torso so deep they looked carved. Her ribs had been inward, some crack from the pressure. When they removed the final layers, the smell became overwhelming. Between her legs, a servant who saw it could only describe it as wrong, either absent or malformed. She could not say which in her. Shocked, the abdomen was distended with fluid and a hard mass. Tumor, abscess. Nobody was allowed to investigate further. They wrapped the body, immediately sealed it in lead. Within hours, the coffin was closed. Before rigor mortis fully set, the servants were scattered across England. The doctors who had attended her 3 died. Within a year, the funeral was spectacular propaganda. But rushed, they wanted that body underground. Before questions multiplied, James became king. The Tudor era ended, and the first thing he did was ensure Elizabeth's tomb stayed sealed forever. 400 years later, it remains locked. Every request to examine her remains has been denied. Other monarchs have been studied, but not her. Why? Because whatever is in that coffin would shatter the myth, and the myth, the virgin queen, pure and powerful and eternal, is worth more to Britain than the truth ever could be. Elizabeth ruled magnificently, but England killed her slowly with poison and pressure and impossible expectations, and then buried the evidence. The real secret of Westminster Abbey is not what is in the coffin. It is why we are still not allowed to look. Some truths are too dangerous, some lies too essential. Some bodies must stay buried so empires can survive. The Virgin Queen is dead.